Thank you for at least agreeing to come on and talk to me today.
Oh, no problem. I'm not doing anything.
So just for people that haven't, just kind of give me a brief background on like how you got to where you're at as far as, licensed clinical social worker and all of that.
That's a long ass story. Sorry, are we allowed to curse?
This is a free speech zone. So I mean, if you've listened to any of the previous episodes or anything that I've done, you can definitely tell that swearing is one of those things that's loud.
Cool. Well, getting my LCSW took 10 years. I knew that was my end goal when I started my bachelor's program. And I knew I wanted to be a social worker because of my own personal history and just kind of wanting to pay it forward and help people in the best way that I can, which is sort of the generic episode or answer. Whenever you ask somebody why you want to be a social worker, they're like, oh, to help people.
Well, it's just interesting because you and I have worked. We've kind of worked together for a few months before I left Central State, and compared to most social workers that I've met, you're the only one that's really been inquisitive as far as looking at, like, say, neuroscience and neuropsychology, and really having more of a interest in researching the why behind things rather than just, oh, we're going to go do therapy and all of this.
Yeah, it's part of like my general thought of life is that if you don't understand why something is happening, you can't change it or you can't meaningfully change it. Like you can change a behavior and not know why it's happening, but that change isn't going to be sustainable. It's not going to remain.
Yeah, that's perfectly understandable. So when you were so at what point, so when you went to like you graduated high school, then you went to college, so social work was what you wanted to do right from the beginning. It wasn't I'm going into undergrad to do one thing and then something happened that kind of got you pointed in the other direction. You kind of just were, this is what we're going to do, and kind of went straight for it. Is that correct?
Sort of. So I went into undergrad undeclared, as I think honestly most students should do. Like at first, I didn't know what I wanted to do, which is fair. And I initially declared graphic design as my major because it was one of my interests. Still is, which is cool, but not what I wanted to spend my life doing. And actually, I can remember over Christmas break being at home with my parents, and this commercial came on for like save the Ukrainian children or whatever in orphanages. And I like burst into tears. And my mom's like, what's wrong with you? And I was like, I have to do something. So I went back to JMU and changed my major. And here we are.
That's
10 years later.
so it was a commercial that you saw on television that kind of tugged at the heartstrings a little bit, and you're like, okay, this is I need to do something about something like this. And then that's where you kind of got pointed into the social work arena of
Yes.
the social sciences.
Yes.
So that's I think that's kind of normal, that anybody that goes into college, they go in for one thing, and then
And then they're like, no.
yeah, something typically points them in the other direction. So when you were doing, so what's the difference between, like, say, psychology and social work, as far as like like, I guess the question is, what's the difference between psychology and social work as far as like what you learn in undergrad and grad school and all of that?
So the prerequisites are pretty much the same,
Mhm.
right? Like child development, abnormal psych, blah, blah, blah. But social workers, then you kind of veer off, right? So psychologists kind of get to more of the thinking and the thinking about stuff. Where social workers, we go and we do the things that you guys are thinking about. Um, so that's kind of where it differs.
Okay, so
But a lot
social
of
work is
social workers and
more.
psychologists are kind of similar.
Yeah, I was just, I guess what I was trying to figure out is So social work's more of applied. It's kind of like counseling in a sense. It's an applied psychological thing. You're taking, uh, like you said, the thinking. You're taking the psychological, but you're applying it like in out in the world. Let's say, then rather than just doing a mix of research and application. It's strictly application. You do a little bit of background research, but that's about as far as that goes. It's not like we have a question, we do like say some review on it, and then try to think of something, a new hypothesis to test and all of that. It's just okay, we have this client with this thing, go and do some reading, be like, oh, okay, that makes sense, and then you apply it as far as that goes.
I'd say that's accurate.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean, it's not obvious that the differences between the different disciplines are all that. While there's major differences, it's subtle differences that are apparent in major ways. I would say that's probably more accurate.
Yes. There's nuances to each profession.
Yes, I would say that I agree with that, because as far as from what I can tell, psychology is more of okay, we're going to do a lot of research and come up with new ideas and new theories, and then we're going to apply that as far as from a clinical perspective. But I've noticed, and I guess this is because I've looked more at the research end of things compared to other people in, say, psychology, or at least in the other disciplines, is that everybody has like a specific niche, and I haven't quite got into that yet. I think is why things are so. As you noticed when we worked together at Central State, there was I know a lot about, like, say, the big five personality, and how you can kind of translate that to like the forensic population within a hospital setting. You can almost apply it in the same way in a prison setting. But I've noticed that other professions that are in those settings, they kind of look at you like, they look at me like I've grown like a hand on my forehead when I try to explain things. And so perhaps maybe you can kind of help me kind of figure out what's exactly going on there.
Can you say all that again? I'm sorry.
It's okay.
You were breaking up a little bit too, so I might have missed part of it.
Okay, so like where I study the big five, it's more broadly more applied more broadly across the whole like population of people, because it's individual differences between all different individuals. Now, there's a lot of research going into the big five and the dimensional like the dimensional aspect of like psychopathology, which is mental illnesses and personality disorders. But when I talk to people in, like, say, the prison setting, or when I was talking to people there at the forensic setting at the hospital, it's trying to explain how you can apply that. So it's almost like the other people, the other disciplines, they don't quite understand that. So where do you think the disconnect is? I guess is the right way of thinking about that.
I think part of it is people, surprisingly enough, don't know about the big five. I learned about the big five from you, to be honest. And then I did my own research, listened to a podcast and all this other stuff. But at least at Central State, like, they don't know or particularly care about the big five. And it's also not like what's hot right now, like the Enneagram or whatever. Like, I can talk with my social work friends about the Enneagram all day.
I'm actually curious about that, because I've talked to some people about the Myers-Briggs. That's probably the most well-known personality construct as far as pop psych goes. But the Enneagram, I don't quite understand that much. So what is the Enneagram?
So you have to take a test similarly to how you take one for the big five. And then it kind of puts you in a category. So there's 9 types: Enneagram 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And they're all kind of labeled like 9, which is me, or apparently, is the peacemaker, which I can identify with. But that's really, it doesn't go many more in depth than that. And it also maybe lists your likes and dislikes, or your preferred. Sorry, my dog was losing his shit. Oh, there's someone at the door. That's why. Oh, okay.
That's all right. My dog will do that sometime too. So it's no biggie. So the Enneagram, there's 9 types, 9 personality types. according to
Yes.
the Enneagram. Okay. So how exactly do the personality traits load onto the Enneagram?
I'm not quite sure. I haven't done a lot of research into it, and I actually tried to compare like my big five traits in my Enneagram, and I realized that my big five traits can be applicable to a couple of other Enneagram types. So it's not as solid, I feel like, as
So the Enneagram's not as solid as the big five?
yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Because
Yeah,
like I
that's
could also be an Enneagram 6. And I'm like, well, this isn't really giving me an answer. It's like you could be this or you could be this. Whereas the big
so
five is very
yeah.
easily listed.
Yeah. And the Enneagram, when you say like the peacekeeper, it almost sounds like it's like personality archetypes.
Yes.
Okay.
That would be more.
So is it predicated on Jung's work is just like like the Myers-Briggs is?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I
Okay.
haven't really dug into the history of the Enneagram, but nobody talks about Carl Jung and the Enneagram together.
Nobody talks about Carl Jung in any any aspect.
Valid.
Because when I worked at Central State, you know, I am a Jungian as far as like one of the influences in my thinking, and so it was kind of interesting. There was a PhD in clinical psychology that worked on the civil side. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Tate or not, but we had a client who had intermittent explosive disorder and borderline personality disorder and a few I think there
Oh
was
boy.
bipolar and fetal alcohol syndrome. So but he played out the archetypal trickster. He would always
Mhm.
cause trouble, but mostly for his own amusement. It was almost like an embodiment of the goddess Eris, the goddess of chaos and discord. And so when I try to explain what the trickster archetype was, or at least what the trickster personality was, of course, patient had to go tell the doctor that this is what so and so on the floor is saying. And so what ended up happening was, and this was so bizarre, is that I was getting a talking to from the clinical psychologist, her intern, and me. And of course, the lady's got her little um, legal pad writing notes and asking me a bunch of questions. I'm like, well, you know, I work on the floor with this guy for, you know, 8 to 16 hours. I see patterns that are, you know, tricks are like in their nature. And, you know, and it seems to me that, you know, if you're wanting someone to get better, you need to point out where their inadequacies are so they can sort that out. And the lady's like, well, I find your personality, the way that you conceptualize that to be kind of disturbing because it's not part of the main nomenclature. And I'm like, well, first of all, how much of Jung's work have you read? And second of all, just because I call it that archetype, it's just it's a way to understand it. Everybody knows what a trickster is. And
Mhm.
third of all, it's like I can see why you would say, you know, this personality disorder because it loads heavily on neuroticism, particularly the volatility aspect. The dude's emotional instability is extremely apparent.
Mhm. Obviously,
Yeah,
bipolar and intermittent explosive and borderline. Yep.
yeah, loads extremely heavily on that. And so, um, and she's like, well, I don't know what that means. I was like, you haven't researched the big five at all. You're a clinical psychologist and you don't know this stuff.
Like, what do you mean you don't know what that means?
Exactly. And so it's just kind of strange to me that, you know, this is that, you know, personality psychology is now kind of taken the reins a bit as far as, you know, doing much of the research in psychopathology. I mean, Colin DeYoung's now on the DSM, what do they call it, committee, where they're looking at
Mhm.
topographies and hierarchical natures of trait dimensions and how personality traits can influence psychopathology. Like openness,
Cool.
to example, is now so is associated with psychoticism to a degree because you're open to, you know, your interest in ideas, interest in aesthetics, and because of your openness to both of those things. And fantasy is associated with trait openness as well. That was McCrae and Costa's thing that they figured out when they came up with the NeoPi R and the NeoPi 3. And so if your brain is giving you false positives and you're interested in fantasy and aesthetics and ideas, then, you know, all of those ideas can get warped into, say, a delusion or hallucinations of some sort.
Sure. I don't think that's very far-fetched or out there at all. I think that's accurate.
Hmm. And so I wonder if just because of my research in that and my understanding of it, I wonder if that's kind of what sets personality psychology kind of outside the main paradigm right now, as far as that goes.
Maybe.
Okay,
I can
so
see how that didn't work at Central State, because at Central State we're pushing people out the door. We're not
Mhm.
digging deep.
No, and that's one of the main problems that I've had, is that we're throwing pills at problems and we're not solving them. And I understand the argument of, well, we have this ethical thing that we have to do where we can't cause any harm, and sometimes digging deep kind of can do that if you don't properly process all of the issues that need to be processed before you do discharge.
Right.
And my thinking is that, well, if we have all of these different psychologists and all these different, social workers that are here that are doing therapy, then what the hell exactly is it that you're doing, other than here's some pills, here's how we change some behavior so that way maybe hopefully you won't come back, but we're not going to hold any high hopes here.
I mean, I'm just a discharge planner.
Well, I don't agree with that at all. I've never agreed with that. I've seen
I'm
some social workers that take that role and say that's what we do,
Yeah.
but you've kind of stepped outside of that.
Mm, yeah. And it also kind of goes along with my kind of personal and professional philosophy. I can discharge you and you come right back. But if I take the time to do it well and to make sure you're actually prepared, not just, oh, can you list your medicine? Like, that's great and it's important. But have you really dug deep and found your own meaning and found your own way? That's also an equally important part of discharging, in my opinion.
Hmm. And see that there's an interesting thing you said there about, finding meaning, and that's associated with existentialism. And I think that's another reason why you and I got along so well, is because of our interest in existential philosophy. Where does that come from?
I don't have a clue.
Well, I mean, you've had to have read. I would assume you've had to have read, like, what was it? Say, mandatory reading that you had to do that kind of resonated, like, say, Frankel's Man's Search for Meaning. I know a lot of classes and typically make that like mandatory reading, which is fantastic.
That was not mandatory reading for me
Hmm.
in any grad school or undergrad.
It was
I
for my
think
it was for my second master's in the theories class. I had to read Man's Search for Meaning, but I'd already read it several times before that.
you're like, yeah, yeah, I've been down. I know. It's fine. I think my first introduction to Carl Jung was actually my senior year of high school. My AP English teacher is pretty existential, and you're frozen.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. My AP high school English teacher was really into existentialism and
Hmm.
Carl Jung, and we actually did mandalas as a class, and she put us in order. And I thought, man, that's pretty cool. Um, but I didn't have the chance to dig into it any deeper because I was like our last day of senior year. And then I went off to college and got busy doing college things and university. And now finally my life has slowed down to the point where I could actually do the research and do the reading, um, and probably actually understand it better.
Yeah. No, that's totally understandable. I'd say my introduction to existentialism was actually, through Jordan's work, reading 12 Rules for Life, and then reading Maps of Meaning, and trying to come to understand it. But I didn't quite know that was the camp or a philosophy. It wasn't until I took the theories class and we started talking about Kierkegaard and Heidegger, which I'd read Kierkegaard uh, way back when I was also reading Nietzsche. And of course, the misconception is Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are philosophers for nihilistic goth teenagers that are just angry at the world, which that's not the case at all. But learning that actually came from existentialist philosophy, I was like, oh, okay, this makes sense. And then, of course, that's when I started looking more at Frankl, and Frankl was considered an existential psychiatrist. And then it was through that class that I was introduced to Irvin Yalom. I had never heard of that guy before, and so I've gone back and read his work too. And so it's like, okay, I can see how all of this has mapped itself out as continuations along that. Let's just say continuations along that school of thought. And you don't really see a whole lot of existentialists out there much anymore. Which kind of brings me to the next question is, given your temperament and your personality and your, how is it that you've managed to kind of step outside of what's considered the main paradigm of thought as far as the social sciences go?
I guess I've always thought that there's something deeper. Like, it's not just this person does this behavior because if they're trying to meet their need. I'm like, no, there's something else there. And especially with like my recent case,
Mhm.
B, like he claims there's nothing in his life that sparked this hideous manifestation of schizophrenia, but there has to be something. So there has to be a deeper reason.
Mhm.
It doesn't just happen out of nowhere. Um, and I think I've always kind of been one to go against the crowd. I've never been a cool kid, so it doesn't matter to
Oh, no.
me.
I mean, it makes sense. I mean, you were talking about, um, schizophrenia is just one of those mental illnesses that just isn't as well understood as, say, like depression or anxiety. And it's because
Right.
we haven't quite figured out the genetic component to that. We do know that there's genes that do activate, and if you decide to, partake in marijuana young, that can increase your risk for manifestations if you carry that genetic component. And
Mhm.
it is a it is a neurological illness. It affects the brain. It's not um, like dementia. That's what it used to be called, dementia praecox, or premature dementia,
Yeah,
but it's not, because it doesn't have that. It's kind of weird because you can relapse to the point where you don't come back, which is a lot like dementia,
yes,
but there's not like there's no objective sense of any deterioration in the brain tissue like dementia has. So
correct.
so the question is like, one question you could ask is it because you have the antipsychotic medications do alter the brain chemistry and the brain structure to a degree. So the constant cycling on and off of those, is that what can say, could that contribute to the degeneration of of the brain's ability to come back cognitively if you relapse and recover many, many times throughout the lifespan?
From my work, and I've seen people who have not been able to recover, especially when I worked on civil side a few years ago.
Mhm.
Um, and it always seems like they need a higher dose or a different dose of a medication. So I absolutely think that medication impacts the brain in that way. And that once you get to that point, schizophrenia can act like dementia.
Yeah. So it's and it's like I said, I don't think we've quite sorted out that out as to how that what can we do as a to make sure that relapse is prevented, other than just psychoeducation and relapse prevention of, hey, when you start to feel this way, what do you notice, so that maybe the doorbell goes off and you might put a stop to that. So there, because I was asked by a inmate why we don't just give medication prematurely. It's like, because if you give antipsychotics to a healthy brain, you're going to cause the brain to be very unhealthy. And well, that's no good, because you've basically caused the very thing that you've tried to prevent.
Correct. I'm actually seeing that happen with one of my patients who's on a mood stabilizer that doesn't need to be. And it's very, very sad because
So how do you?
he was a very bright young man. I
Mhm.
mean, goal oriented, not symptomatic at all. and they push meds because, well, he's in GRI, so he has to be on meds.
Now,
which I disagree with
who's this they?
I'm not gonna
No,
say.
you don't have to say names. It's just who's the they that says that because someone's in dry, they have to be on medication. If they don't need it, they don't need it.
Correct.
'Cause
It's the general thought at Central State, especially among psychiatrists,
Mhm.
and also among kind of the approval boards for discharging NGRIs. They like to see people on medicine because medicine equals stability.
Well,
But
for certain illnesses, I would agree with that, but I would say for certain
sure,
illnesses, not so much because medication doesn't really help with like personality disorders. The clinical literature and the research on that is very clear that you
correct.
cannot medicate a personality disorder. You might be able to do something about some of the symptoms of that, like
Correct.
borderline, exactly. For example, has that emotional volatility. And so, a mood stabilizer kind of helps with the mood swings on that, but that's all that's doing is just helping with the emotional stability. But even then, the mood stabilizer can be done away with enough therapy, enough skill work to where you can kind of bring the neuroticism level back and kind of down if that person wants to transform their personality. So, it's not
And
personality
that's
is
a
not
real big
something
if.
yeah, it is a real big if. And that's one of the things I really like about Glasser's reality therapy and choice theory is it's like, look, how has this been working out for you for X amount of years? Wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to do this crap anymore? Well, what can we do? What could you do to change it? If you don't, if this isn't working for you, you can change what you're doing.
Absolutely. Totally agree. But back to my original point with the guy with the mood stabilizer, like he went from this very bright young man, goal oriented, wants to be an orthopedic surgeon, to very slowed cognitively. He used to be able to keep up with me when I would do group. And now he's like, oh, well, can you repeat that question? Which isn't a problem. I'll repeat a question all day long, but that's just a market difference in him that I've noticed.
Now, is it a symptom of the mood stabilizer, or is there something going on that's damaging the brain's cognitive ability to keep up?
It seems to be correlated with an increase in the mood stabilizer. He's being titrated up to a therapeutic dose, even though he was asymptomatic on the lowest dose possible. So I'm not sure I understand why we have to titrate up if he's asymptomatic.
Yeah, I don't understand that at all. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. I could understand if someone's symptomatic, but if they're not, then um
Then why? Like, what's the purpose?
yeah, because all that's being done now is is someone's being harmed for the sake of looking good.
Right. On paper.
Looking good on paper, yeah. Looking good in the eyes of, say, whoever it is that's set these standards there. And I guess that's another reason why I was never really part of the cool kids club over there, is because I would point out these kind of things that I didn't think made sense and say, I don't think this is a good idea. Here's why I don't think this is a good idea. And of course, it's well, you're not a doctor.
I said that in treatment team the other day because we had treatment team with him.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, maybe we could consider like not going up to the next slash final level of the titration. And our treatment team was like, no, he needs to be on that. And I'm like, but why? He's cognitively slowed. You can see it in his speech if you remember him from a couple months ago before this titration started. And they were like, well, let's see what he says. And I'm like, okay, I'll lead the interview. It's fine. And I asked him, I said, have you noticed any cognitive slowing in your thought process or anything like that? And he was like, no. And so then our team, despite objective observations from staff, me, the treatment team in that moment, they're like, well, he said he didn't notice anything, so we're going to keep pushing it. And I'm like, well, where does your medical judgment come in as a medical professional?
My mother-in-law says this, and I do agree with her to a degree. So don't think that I'm being insulting here, but most people who end up working for the state are those who couldn't do out in the real world. So it's like the last safe haven where you can try to apply what you're supposedly learn and you don't have to be responsible to anybody for it.
You were breaking up a lot. I didn't hear
Sorry.
you.
I said my mother-in-law says that people who work for the state are those who couldn't hack it in the real world, and so the state's like the last place they can try to apply their trade and not be held responsible for their inability to actually do in the world.
I can see that with some folks.
Yeah, like I said, it's not an insult directed toward you. It's more like a observation, and it's like the case that you explained to me the other day that my God, if this person was in the real world, they wouldn't have a job.
I know. In
Yeah.
fact, she was in the real world, and that didn't pan out for her real well.
No, and apparently because she works for the state, she can still make the same stupid mistakes and do the same things and not be held responsible.
There should be a spicy update later this week. I'll keep you posted.
I certainly look forward to that. So yeah, I've noticed not only clinically do you kind of stand on the outside paradigm there, but even politically, because most of the social workers that we know tend to tilt very far to the left, and you are an exception to that. So how is it that you were able to kind of avoid stepping into that trap?
I look at the problems they propose that are the problems. And then I look at the solutions that they propose to be the solutions, which actually end up being not the problem, but a symptom, and not a solution, but a Band-Aid, if that makes any sense.
No,
And my parents,
I think it does make sense.
and bless my parents, though that they have flaws and I have flaws, they always taught me to think critically and think independently. If so-and-so is jumping off a bridge, do you? No.
No. Or as my dad used to say, if you see somebody eating dog poo, are you gonna put a handful in your mouth too? And it's like, yeah, no.
No.
Not gonna
So just because it's like the cool thing or the in thing, or because it makes people feel good because they think that they're helping someone, doesn't mean that that's actually what that is.
I've also noticed too that you get a lot of people together. That's when you start to see these thoughts and these ideas and these philosophies really tend to embody and act out. But if you break up the groups into these individuals, they only know a small little section of they have a small, what would you say? They have a small inkling of the ideas they're being taught. They're not really fully understanding the philosophy that they're being taught, that they're acting out. And because
they're not fully understanding the data that's
Mm-mm.
presented to them,
Mm-mm.
or questioning it for that matter.
No, and it's so weird that everything's become so ideologically driven. It's kind of like this whole coronavirus stuff, and I'm sure you've heard me be critical of it a lot. It's like the real risk of hospitalization amongst people who are vaccinated, and now this might include the unvaccinated, I'm not sure, but it's like hospitalization risk is like 2%. Instead of, it's not 50-50 like people think, it's 2%.
Correct.
Okay, so let's make the argument that it affects vaccinated, unvaccinated at that rate as long as you're healthy. You don't have any comorbid problems or anything of that nature. So if your risk of hospitalization is 2%, then why are we acting as if things are worse than what they really are?
I think it's probably due to the media. And I don't mean just like the news, I mean like Instagram and Facebook, and
Oh yeah.
you're just constantly bombarded. So you have no choice but to think, well, gosh, maybe it is that bad, when maybe it's not.
Oh yeah, I agree with that. It's like this idea that that there's this epidemic of school shootings. They happen very rarely. The worst ones are the ones that catch the media's attention, and those are the ones that everybody focuses on. Or the police encounters with people that turn out really, really bad. It's all over social media. But I would say that those encounters are probably not the norm. They're the outliers, but that's what everybody looks to. So they take these subsets or these really small substrata of events and use that to paint the broadest picture possible.
Mhm.
And I don't understand where people's critical thinking comes in. It's like, oh, well, you have this one event and this is everything. It's like, no, not really when you think about it. Because if you look at the actual data, you can see that these outliers are just that. They're outliers. They're tragic. Nobody disagrees with that at all. But you can't use one or two instances and paint with a broad brush to say that that's every instance, because that's just incorrect.
I agree. And I
So,
think there's often many more factors than what people
mhm.
think about.
Oh yeah, many variables have to be taken into account. I think this,
Right.
yeah,
I mean, just like with school shootings, people with Columbine, particularly, they focused on video games. Well, no, Eric had a narcissistic personality disorder, and Dylan was a follower who was depressed and suicidal already. So you take that combo, and
I would say that the fellow that had narcissism was also a psychopath too,
oh, absolutely. Yes.
because
Oh,
he was narcissistic to the degree that he thought that he was superior to everybody else. But he was
extremely
absolutely, but
narcissistic.
he was also very psychopathic because he thought the world being would be better if it didn't exist.
Yes.
I don't know if you've ever read his journal entries and his writings, but they still make the hair on the back of my neck stand up every time I read it, because how can someone that young have so much contempt and resentment for the world?
I mean, he was just a kid. He was
Mhm.
what, 16, 17?
Yeah.
If that. Yeah, I read a book about Columbine. Who was it by? I can't remember who it was by right now, but it was a really good book. And it had pieces of their journal entries. So,
Their whole journal entries are online. I Googled theirs and I read every single page of theirs. And I can't, like, I was a, angry adolescent that loved heavy metal music just as much as the next, teen with long hair, but it never at any point in my adolescence did I think that, things were so bad and that people were so awful that their extinction would be the answer.
right.
And that is
I mean, to some extent, teenage angst is normal.
oh
I
yeah.
mean, I was an angsty teenager.
Well, I mean, angst is so Kierkegaard would say that angst is an existential state of being. And so you have to figure out something worthwhile to do with your life so that way the angst decreases, or at least you don't pay attention to it, but it's still going to be there.
Yep.
And so
Maybe my existentialism was budding as a teenager.
that's quite possible. I know that's when I started reading Friedrich Nietzsche, was back when I was in high school and all of that, because
Casual, just a teenager reading Nietzsche.
well, okay, so one of my favorite bands, as everybody knows and I've talked about, is Cradle of Filth, and they would take quotes, I think out of context, but they would take quotes from Friedrich Nietzsche and put them in some of the booklets. There's a quote from Nietzsche in the album booklet for Dusk and Her Embrace, and I can't remember what it was. It's something about like men do not yield themselves to angels or something like that. It's just a small snippet of a quote. Sounds cool as hell if you're a teenager that likes hard rock, heavy metal, and you dress in all black. It's like the coolest
Right.
thing ever. But when you actually read like Nietzsche's work, it's like Nietzsche's not exactly here, like condemning Christianity for the sake of being cool, or this triumphant like atheist viewpoint. It's there's a genuine warning here of like, maybe we need to not be so what would you be so assuming that what we know is absolutely correct, and maybe we should be careful about what we do with the metaphysical structure of our existence, let's say, because some pretty bad things are going to come our way if we don't put a stop in to it at some point.
Totally agree.
And so it was kind of fascinating. That's what I got out of Nietzsche's work, as a teenager. But and I was looking for that cool atheistic thing at the time. Where was I going with all of this? But
I'm sorry, I derailed the conversation.
No, it's
into
fine.
Columbine.
No, this is why I like doing these podcasts, these long form conversations, because to me, you can't really get to you don't really get to know what people are thinking unless you go through this sort of exercise.
Absolutely.
But going back to Columbine, it wasn't just the video games they were going after, but they were going after music and stuff like that too.
Right. But those were the only factors that precipitated the shootings. And I think that was my point, is most times people are very black and white in their thinking. And like,
Mhm.
no, it's not just video games. It's not just the hard rock music, metal, whatever they listen to. It's a conglomerate of factors. Their
Yeah,
home life, their mental life, their emotional life, their psychopathology. It's
yeah,
all of it.
absolutely. And the black and white isn't just in the thinking of what precipitates these events, but the reactions to them as well. Because God, I'm going to be showing my age here, but I was a freshman in high school when that happened, and so because I
Wow.
had long hair and dressed in black, I was expelled just on how I looked.
That's some shit.
Well, I mean,
I'm sorry, but it is. They're
yes,
just stereotyping.
it is, and it was also predicated on someone making a false accusation of someone threatening violence, because they basically said that weird dude on the bus with the long hair said he's going to kill everybody, and of course I was asleep. And of course the next 8 hours of my day was the most bizarre, that you can't make this stuff up. I show up for homeroom, I'm there for 20 minutes, and we go to a first class. I want to say that was math class, and
Ugh.
I had
That's in the
I had
morning.
well, I had my guitar with me because I had guitar class every day. It was like the fourth or fifth periods. It was after lunch. It was in the band room and we were playing guitar. And so the principal comes in and says, I need to see you in my office. And he's like, you need to grab your things. And I'm like, what? Why? And I had just come back from a 45-day suspension because I did something stupid. And
At least you own that.
hey, I wanted to have friends and thought, well, maybe if I take some of my parents' prescription medications to school and distribute them, like I try to be, Mr. Cool drug dealer, which I wasn't a drug dealer, nor was I cool, but obviously I wasn't very good at it because I got caught. And that was a fun 45-day suspension. I learned never to do that ever again.
You're lucky you only got 45 days.
Well, they wanted to do a full year suspension or a full year expulsion, but my parents were like, this is a first time offense.
Fair.
Our kid was being dumb. He admits he was being dumb. Can we just move forward with this? So I had only been back in school 2 days, and Columbine happens. I go in the morning. I expect math class to suck, and then try to get through the rest of the day just to get to guitar class, and then get through the rest of the day and go home. And I get the principal coming in, be like, grab your things. I need you to come with me, sitting in the office. And then they don't even talk to me like for the first bit of the morning. I'm sitting there in the hallway. And so one of the principals come by, I was like, can I get my guitar? Can I just like sit here and just doodle around for the rest of the day, or however long I'm going to be back here? And they say no, because we don't want you killing anybody with your guitar strings. I'm like, why the hell would I do that? Like,
Are you going to make a garage?
I guess that's what they thought I was going to do, but all I wanted to do was just sit and doodle around waiting. Finally, they get me in the office. They say, well, you've been accused of doing this and da da da. I'm just like, no, I honestly didn't do this one. If I had done it, I would have told you, but no, I didn't. And so they're like, well, what were you doing? I was like, well, I was asleep on the bus. I had my headphones in. I was listening to Metallica. That's what I do in the mornings.
Slept through Metallica.
Kill 'em all. I was listening to Kill 'em all, ironically enough, the first record.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, nothing's more hilarious than having a 50-year-old man in a suit sitting across from you from his desk, holding out the cassette. This is how long it was. Cassettes were still a thing.
I know about cassettes. Don't get me started.
And so having the cassette booklet flipped out and started reading, like sing reading the lyrics of Seek and Destroy at me. It's like,
Gross.
I'm like, dude, I know the song. I mean, I play this in my bedroom, I do not need you to explain the lyrics to me. I kind of know the words quite well, and your rhythm is
And
off.
you're tearing it up.
Yeah. I actually said, you're off key and your rhythm is terrible. And he told me to shut up, and I wasn't as funny as I thought I was.
I think it's hilarious.
So
And you totally would. You would look him dead in the face and be like, your rhythm's off.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So then, I had got home and explained everything to my parents, and my parents were trying to fight the school board to let me go back to school. Being 16 and taking a polygraph exam is fun.
Ooh,
Let me tell you.
sounds traumatizing.
Well, my dad's,
or at least intimidating.
my dad's thought was, well, if I can show that I was telling the truth and there's no deception indicated, then they really don't have a leg to stand on. It's just one person's word against mine. And if I pass a polygraph, then what?
Fair.
Which I passed the polygraph, but they said, okay, so they just expelled me for the rest of the year, let me go to alternative school. And if I completed the classes that I did in alternative school, I could go back to regular school the next year. And I had to go to therapy. So I had to have a psychological evaluation by a clinical psychologist. That's
to be cleared to go to school.
To be cleared to go to school. And this is when I found out, oh, he's got adjustment disorder. That's why he does stupid shit whenever things go wrong. It's like, okay, cool, man, cool. Yeah. Fun times
with teenage Sean.
Oh yeah. And looking people dead in the face and just saying things that I know is going to piss somebody off that is just a trait that I've had forever. It's not antisocial. It's just, I call things like I see it, and I don't really care about somebody's feelings at that point.
Yes. I can absolutely see that in you. And sometimes I wish I had that trait, but
you have to learn to be disagreeable at some point. It's like, here's a good example. When I worked at Smith's there in Elko, I had already taken, I had Psych 101. I took Psychology of Human Relations, and I took a personality class with Stephanie Davis. And I remember when we took Psych 101, we had to go through the DSM-5 and write a paper about different disorders. Now,
I did mine. What I did in Psych 101.
I took panic disorder, but I did read through the DSM, and narcissistic personality kind of stood out for me for some reason. So the store manager there, the Elko Smiths, actually has narcissistic personality, I think. And he used to call me in his office because he'd get pissed off about something that I had done, or we had a personality conflict. Like, one of the things is he wrote me up. I had pneumonia and I had to miss work, and he wrote me up for attendance, and I had a doctor's note and turned it in. So there's something kind of wrong there, if you ask me. But
like, you should be commended for not going to work sick.
Yeah, I know, because pneumonia sucks. Like, my lungs hurt so damn bad. It's not even funny. I had to have an inhaler and all this other shit. Was terrible.
Ugh,
that's terrible. But I forget. I got called in the office for some damn thing, and I'd had enough of Glenn at this point. I'd had enough of him. And so I went on Google, and you can find out about people. And he used to be a stockbroker in New York, and he lost some people a lot of money when the recession hit back in 2008.
Oh boy.
And so he was always like hitting on the female cashiers and hitting on female customers and just saying inappropriate things.
Don't.
And he called me in the office. He's like, I don't like your attitude, and you're always just smarting off whenever anybody has something to say, and just listed off these things. And some of these criticisms were fair. Like, I have arthritis. I can't move as fast in the damn dairy cooler, and you're going to stick me in the dairy cooler for 8 hours, and there's no chance to get a lunch. This is middle of Mormon country, so on a Sunday you're going through, God, anywhere between 50 and 60 little square cartons of milk a day. a day. And so some of the criticisms were fair. And he's like, you got anything you want to say? And I was like, well, some of your criticisms are fair. I said, here's what I think, though. So I think you have this grandiose sense of your self-importance here because you think you're God's gift to women because you go and you hit on all the cashiers, even though you're creepy and you kind of freak them out, and maybe you should stop doing that. Also, I think you take this store manager position way too damn seriously, but I think it's because it's the way you make up for your inadequacies, because you used to be this big shot broker on Wall Street, and then you lost that couple, what was it, 2, 3, was it $4 million, I think I read. And so now, how far the mighty have fallen, that you've gone from big power broker on New York to the middle of a dirt pit in the middle of Nevada. And you're the store director. And I guess your mom's pretty damn proud of you for that. And so you kind of have to find some way to make the big power plays, don't you?
Yeah, Sean.
The assistant manager, she was sitting right beside me. Her jaw hit the floor.
I believe it.
And he just looked at me. He's like, he balled up his fist. Like you could see his knuckles were turning white. And he just looked at me. He's like, you need to get the fuck out of my office and get back to work.
Oh my.
I said, okay.
Thanks. Good chat.
And so the assistant manager, she's like, I've never seen anyone have the balls to say something like that to him. I was like, he's a narcissist. That's exactly what it is. It's like when you call them out on their behavior, look at how they react. Somebody that's going to take those criticisms and look at you like they want to like just beat the crap out of you. Just you can see it. Any slight criticism it cuts a major wound.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, my husband was talking and I was like, who is he talking to? The dog?
We talk to our dogs. I used to sit there and think out loud, and then I moved here, and then I went to Central State and was like, yeah, nope, I think I'm just
gotta stop that now.
Yeah, exactly. So Jordan Peterson, how did you come to get into that whole what would you say? How did you first come to know about Jordan? Because that's another thing we have in common, is that we both study his work and are fans of his.
Yes. Well, I'd venture to say we have many things in common, Sean. My husband was the one who got me into Jordan Peterson. He's been listening to Jordan for several years. And I got into him probably most recently, like within the last couple of years as the pandemic and stuff hit, and I had nothing else better to do with my life than to watch YouTube videos. And also as I quit a job that was extremely toxic, and I needed something to give me meaning while I worked at Dick's Sporting Goods and tried to heal my brain. So that's kind of how I got into Jordan, and his work just really makes a lot of sense, and it brings together a lot of other things I'm interested in, kind of like John Vervaeke and some of the other folks we listen to. They do that, and I try to incorporate some of his stuff into my work, because I find that my guys need that level of meaning. They don't want just someone spewing psychoeducation at them like, oh, what are the symptoms of schizophrenia? Because they can tell me, but if it doesn't mean anything, it doesn't matter.
Oh yeah, I agree with you, and I commend you that you've been able to do that, and they've actually been able to make those connections. Because I tried that a few times, and I don't think I was very successful, and it might just be my approach at how I approach it.
One of my patients told me the other day that my class was hard because it's more like a college class than a hospital group, and I'm like, okay, that's a fair observation.
I try to do it the same way. In fact, I think I remember, was it a patient or was it one of my former coworkers that said it was out in left field because I taught about Nazis and communists when I made people read the Gulag Archipelago and Man Search for Meaning. And it's not that I was trying to teach about Nazis and communists, but about, you have these two extreme, terrible situations that people found themselves in, and yet they've been able to survive and transcend that, because Auschwitz is about as bad as it gets. And the gulag's pretty damn terrible too. And so it's like, if you read these things, you shouldn't be looking at, well, this is Nazis and communists. It's, you have labor camps and you have death camps, and you have two individuals who looked at, okay, how did I end up here? And what can I do so that I can get out of here and I can live through it? Frankel wanted to get out of Auschwitz on his feet, not in a body bag. And Solzhenitsyn wanted to get out of the gulags, by his own volition and not in a body bag either, or be, buried out in the snow in the middle of Siberia.
Was there a question in there? Or
Yeah.
just...
the question was,
Sorry.
like how have you been able to make it so successful? I think that's amazing that you can do that.
Thanks. I sent you that PowerPoint that I made last week because I noticed I would repeat. So we're going through the 12 rules of life, right? I would repeat the rule over and over and over again. And I'm like, well, maybe they need a visual. So I made that PowerPoint. It was great. The guys appreciated it. I also incorporate some snippets of Jordan's videos. There's a lobster video that I used in the first one, which is really great. I use a lot of questions, like discussion questions, to prompt. I try to relate it to their life as much as I can. Last week we talked about the rule, don't let your children do something you don't like or whatever, or become someone.
Yeah, don't
What
allow
is it?
your children to do things that make you dislike them.
Right. So we talked about raising kids and how to effectively discipline a kid and stuff like that. And they really got into it. Because a lot of my guys are dads and they want to be better for their kids, obviously. So we had a really good discussion about what that looks like and what that means. The week before we talked about relationships, like, oh, your relationship with yourself and then your relationship with other people and how those things matter. Your relationship with yourself is like the most important relationship you have. So in what way can you change that, or does it need to be changed? How do you talk to yourself on a daily basis?
What do you do to take care of yourself like someone who you're responsible for helping,
That was a big one.
Well,
and I am guilty of not doing that.
The way I look at it's like, if you don't treat yourself better, how are you going to treat anybody else better? You have to take care of your room. You have to take care of your things. You have to take care of yourself so that you can take care of other people. Because if you can't do for yourself, how the hell are you supposed to do for anybody else? And that kind of goes into this whole thing that, I've met somebody at work who has read 12 rules and doesn't agree with it as far as it's great for the individual, but it doesn't tackle the problems within the system or systemic problems. And it's like, well, actually it does if you think about it, because if individuals get themselves together, then the system will sort itself out because the individuals are sorted out.
Correct. And when I was teaching the other day, I was a guest speaker for MSW mental health class. And they were like, why do you think the census is so high? And I said, well, the system is overburdened. There's too many patients, not enough beds, not enough resources. If people would take the time to sort themselves out, the system would work better. And they were like, oh, that makes sense. And I was like, that's a little Jordan Peterson for you.
I've noticed that when I actually would quote Jordan Peterson, like if I say his name, there's like this instant disgust kick. Have you noticed that too?
Yes. They're like, oh, not Jordan Peterson.
Where have you seen the disgust reactions when you discuss Jordan's work?
Sometimes I see it in my patients who have more of a cultural knowledge that haven't been institutionalized for a bazillion years. Sometimes I see it with my coworkers that are like, no. Or just haven't, they have this preconceived notion that he's just this wild Canadian out here spewing random ideas. But he's not.
He's the keeper of the patriarchy. That's that one article that was written about him, and I forget what newspaper it was, but when I was taking those classes for that counseling degree, if I mentioned Jordan's name, people would have this instant disgust look. But yeah, when you actually talk about the ideas, everyone's like, okay. When I did that mental health conference a couple of weeks ago, when we were discussing, what to do about some of the problems, I said, from an existentialist perspective, it's like, look, people's lives are awful. They're terrible and they're full of tragedy. And if you haven't really experienced that now, you probably will in the future, or you'll know somebody who's gone through it or is going through something like that. That's just the nature of life
Of
itself.
life. Mm-hmm.
It's what you choose to do in the face of that suffering is what matters. And so that's one of the things that I try to talk to with the inmates that are there for like these life sentences, is like, life in prison is extremely terrible. And
Yeah.
that's saying something, because life itself is extremely terrible at times. But it's what do you choose to do in the face of that really matters. And someone's like, oh, I really like that. Where do these ideas come from? And I was like, well, I learned it from reading Frankl. I learned it from reading Jung, and I learned it from Jordan Peterson. And that's where, the eyes go wide. And when I mentioned, because I in that same conversation, I talked about the importance of cleaning up one's room. There was one guy who just kind of laughed and nodded, kind of like, yeah, cool. This dude's saying the thing. But as far as I knew, the only people that knew of Jordan Peterson was myself, you, Garcia, and Dr. Parikh were the only four that I knew the name Jordan Peterson. Everybody else just kind of didn't have that awareness, or he's the boogeyman that they put in the closet that doesn't exist.
Yep. That's what I experience a lot of the times.
And then we had that. Now you work with the patient that compared me to Jordan Peterson.
Yes.
Which was kind of cool, but kind of interesting in the same
He
sense.
mentions that almost every group when we do our 12 rules group on Tuesdays. He's like, do you still keep in touch with that Jordan Peterson guy? I'm like, yeah, he's actually a really good friend of mine.
The Jordan Peterson guy, that's me.
That's a high compliment, Sean.
Well, I mean, it's kind of strange to me that's the takeaway, is that somebody mentioned that when I taught the mental health part for the phase 1 training. Someone's like, oh, you really remind me of Jordan Peterson, the way you talk about things. Because when we talked about self-care, it's like, here's some things that you might want to do. First of all, treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping. If you know what it's like when you get stressed out, well, maybe you should treat yourself like you would treat someone else that is stressed out. Mm-hmm. Because you being stressed out is not going to help you, especially in this environment, for one. 2, do not do things that you hate. That comes from the new book. It's not about, well, I don't like getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock in the morning, and maybe I won't do that. No, it means don't do things that you're going to hate yourself for. It's kind of like why I made the decision to leave. It's like I could have stayed there part-time for another 2 or 3 years, but would I really be happy doing that?
No. As Vervaeke would say, that's not your flow state.
No, it's not.
And that's not where you're happy, where you're growing.
Mm-mm.
And that's okay. That is okay.
The great things have happened since I left. I got to quit that goddamn counseling program.
Hell yeah. You were so happy.
Let me ask you this. Since is social work, when you were doing the social work program, did they kind of like have this territorial stance toward things and be like, well, the psychologists are only good for testing people, and the counselors are only good for X amount, but we're the greatest of the social science disciplines around, kind of thing? Or
yes, it was kind of portrayed that social workers were a master of all. Therefore we are the best. Like, we have psychology background, we are the doers, we are the thinkers, we are the workers. We get shit done, which is true. We do.
I'm not disagreeing with that as far as the application part is
concerned. But I disagree with saying that one profession is better than another. All professions are necessary.
Oh yeah.
We have our own strengths. Yeah. I can't prescribe meds, and nor do I want to.
I wouldn't want to be responsible for that either. But social workers have very tough jobs because you go.
Very tough. I spent an hour ordering shit off Walmart for one of my patients.
That's, I would say, a minor annoyance compared to what, my mind's eye of what social workers put themselves through in certain environments. Like,
I was being
like
sarcastic.
okay, so like abused children, things of that nature is something that I could never really, I don't see myself being able to handle that.
I interviewed for a job with Child Protective Services in Charlottesville. Um, and it was actually a toss up of being a social worker on civil side at Central versus the CPS job. And I was like, I'll go work at Central State. I can't do CPS. And that's also what I learned when I worked at VCU, because I worked there for about 6 months in the ER at night.
Yeah, and you said that that was actually the most if there was everything that you could compare to hell, why don't you do you feel
Sure.
comfortable talking about that? Like, what is it
Yeah.
that made that hell for you?
There were a few different things. Um, most nights I worked alone. So it was just me handling every social work event. And that was everything from arranging car rides home to people who took an ambulance to the hospital that were not being admitted so they could go home, to figuring out if we need to call CPS on these kids who are here with their overdosing mom or with a random burn or something like that, to watching people die. Um, there are many times people came in for cardiac arrest and they didn't make it, and I had to watch them do hours of CPR before they called it. Being alone in that and not having the skills to deal with it was what tore me apart.
Oh wow.
And it still affects me. I think I told you about the time I drove past that car accident.
Yeah, we both drove past
Yep.
that accident, and that was
Yeah,
absolutely hell.
that was awful. That brought it all back. It was a very visceral response
Yeah,
to me. And I was not in a good place for a while.
hmm. No,
And
I was not okay after that because they did a terrible job of trying to shield drivers from that.
they didn't. I saw a blood-soaked sheet.
Same here. It was not
And
a,
not just that it's traumatizing to you and I or brings up our own stuff. It's also extremely kind of disrespectful
mhm.
to that person and to that person's family.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that.
And that was something I had to deal with in the ER too, was how do we let these families grieve, but also how do we preserve their dignity?
I don't know how to even begin how to answer that question.
I was never given any guidance. And a lot of times, if that kind of call came in, it would take up most of my night while I was also receiving other calls to go deal with other shit. So, like, I couldn't deal with this and this be done. I dealt with part of it, would run away and go do other things and come
Yeah,
back and deal with part of it again.
so it sounds like you had to basically compartmentalize all these traumatic things, and basically, okay, we'll deal with this later. We still have all these other things to do, and that's part of the reason why I shied away from that, because I actually had a professor try to push me toward that, and I was like, that's not really what I want to do, and so
Towards social work?
yeah. And so yeah, her thing is that social work lost a potential great social worker because I decided to go toward being a psychologist, and well, I think I'm much better at that than I would be for the other. It's like I would be a much better clinical psychologist than I think a mental health counselor, because I don't think just having the base theory at hand is sufficient.
I agree. And I think there are a lot of social workers, especially in my MSW, my BSW classes, like they just disregarded theory. They're like, I hate theory. I don't want to learn about this. And I'm like, but you see why it's important. And they're like, no, this isn't relative to like the work I'm going to do. And I'm like, actually, it is.
Yeah, it's extremely important. I mean, how are you going to do therapy for someone if you don't understand their damn personality? How are you going to
Right.
figure out what approach to use? And that's one of the things that I really disliked about the counseling program, is they pick a theory and that's what you do. No. And that's a question I can't stand. What's your theoretical orientation? It's like, well, first of all, I don't know what you mean by theoretical orientation. I'm oriented philosophically toward existentialism, but I think reality therapy, CBT, have their uses. Psychoanalytic thinking.
Mhm.
I do engage in. I'm a psychoanalytic thinker too.
No way. Just kidding.
And so you can't just say, well, okay, here's one bloody theory and that's what you're going to use. Or
Right.
eclectic approach is what I call it. It's like I have an eclectic approach. It depends on
Depends on
what
the patient. It depends on their diagnosis. It depends on
what's
what works for them,
yeah,
not what works for me.
exactly.
And I tell that to my guys all the time. I mean, I'm like, this this is an example of how this works for me. It might not work for you. What works for you might not work for me, and that's cool.
Yeah. All
But
right.
yeah,
Well, that's about all the time we're going to have for today. Thank you again for coming on.
you're welcome. Thank you for having me. This was a cool
Yeah.
experience.
Hey, and who knows, maybe we can try to expound on some of these things in the future.
Cool. I'm into it.
All right. Thank you so much. And you
Absolutely.
have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
You too, Sean. Have a good one.
You too.